Stephen+Gowans Do Publicly Owned Planned Economies Work? What Soviet public ownership and planning did for ordinary citizens of the USSR. The benefits of the Soviet economic system were found in the elimination of the ills of capitalism, an end to unemployment, inflation, depressions and recessions, and extremes of wealth and poverty, an end to exploitation, which is to say, the practice of living off the labor of others, and the provision of a wide array of free and virtually free public services. Among the most important accomplishments of the Soviet economy was the abolition of unemployment. Not only did the Soviet Union provide jobs for all, work was considered a social obligation, of such importance that it was enshrined in the Constitution. The 1936 Constitution stipulated that, quote, citizens of the USSR have the right to work, that is, are guaranteed the right to employment and payment for their work in accordance with quantity and quality. End quote. On the other hand, making a living through means other than work was prohibited. Hence, deriving an income from rent, profits, speculation, or the black market, social parasitism, was illegal. Zemansky, 1984. Finding a job was easy, because labor was typically in short supply. Consequently, employees had a high degree of bargaining power on the job, with obvious benefits in job security and management paying close attention to employee satisfaction. From Kotz, 2003. Article 41 of the 1977 Constitution capped the work week at 41 hours. Workers on night shift worked 7 hours, but received full 8-hour shift pay. Workers employed at dangerous jobs, e.g. mining, or where sustained alertness was critical, e.g. physicians, worked 6 or 7-hour shifts, but received full-time pay. Overtime work was prohibited except under special circumstances. Zemansky, 1984. From the 1960s, employees received an average of 1 month vacation. From Zemansky, 1984, which could be taken at subsidized resorts. From Kotz, 2003. All Soviet citizens were provided a retirement income, men at the age of 60 and women at the age of 55. The right to a pension, as well as disability benefits, was guaranteed by the Soviet Constitution, Article 43, 1977, rather than being revocable and subject to the momentary whims of politicians, as is the case in capitalist countries. Women were granted maternity leave from their jobs with full pay as early as 1936, and this too, along with many other benefits, was guaranteed in the Soviet Constitution, Article 122, 1936. At the same time, the 1936 Constitution made provision for a wide network of maternity homes, nurseries, and kindergartens, while the revised 1977 Constitution obligated the state to help, quote, the family by providing and developing a broad system of child care, by paying grants on the birth of a child, by providing children's allowances and benefits for large families. End quote. From Article 53. The Soviet Union was the first country to develop public child care. Women in the USSR were accorded equal rights with men in all spheres of economic, state, cultural, social, and political life. Article 122, 1936. Including the equal right with men to employment, rest and leisure, social insurance, and education. Among its many firsts, the USSR was the first country to legalize abortions, which were available at no cost. Sherman, 1969. It was also the first country to bring women into top government positions. An intense campaign was undertaken in Soviet Central Asia to liberate women from the misogynist oppression of conservative Islam. This produced a radical transformation of the conditions of women's lives in these areas. The right to housing was guaranteed under a 1977 constitutional provision, Article 44. Urban housing space, however, was cramped, about half of what it was per capita in Austria and West Germany. The reasons were inadequate building in Tsarist times, the massive destruction of housing during World War II, and Soviet emphasis on heavy industry. Prior to the October Revolution, inadequate urban housing was built for ordinary people. After the revolution, new housing was built, but the housing stock remained insufficient. Housing draws heavily on capital, which the government needed urgently for the construction of industry. In addition, Nazi invaders destroyed 1/3 to 1/2 of Soviet dwellings during the Second World War. City dwellers typically lived in apartment buildings owned by the enterprise in which they worked, or by the local government. Rents were dirt cheap by law, about 2 to 3% of the family budget, while utilities were 4 to 5%. This differed sharply with the United States, where rents consumed a significant share of the average family budget, and still do. Food staples and other necessities were subsidized, while luxury items were sold well above their costs. Public transportation was efficient, extensive, and practically free. Subway fare was about 8 cents in the 1970s, unchanged from the 1930s. Nothing comparable has ever existed in capitalist countries. This is because efficient, affordable, and extensive public transportation would severely limit the profit-making opportunities of automobile manufacturers, petroleum companies, and civil engineering firms. In order to safeguard their profits, these firms use their wealth, connections, and influence to stymie development of extensive, efficient, and inexpensive public alternatives to private transportation. Governments, which need to keep private industry happy so that it continues to provide jobs, are constrained to play along. The only way to alter this is to bring capital under public control, in order to use it to meet public policy goals set out in a consciously constructed plan. The Soviet Union placed greater stress on healthcare than their capitalist competitors did. No other country had more physicians per capita or more hospital beds per capita than the USSR. In 1977, the Soviet Union had 35 doctors and 212 hospital beds per 10,000, compared to 18 doctors and 63 hospital beds in the United States. Most important, healthcare was free. That U.S. citizens had to pay for their healthcare was considered extremely barbaric in the Soviet Union, and Soviet citizens, quote, often questioned U.S. tourists quite incredulously on this point, end quote. From Sherman, 1969. Education through university was also free, and stipends were available for post-secondary students, adequate to pay for textbooks, room and board, and other expenses. Income inequality in the Soviet Union was mild compared to capitalist countries. The difference between the highest income and the average wage was equivalent to the difference between the income of a physician in the United States and an average worker, about 8 to 10 times higher. The elite's higher incomes afforded privileges no greater than being able to acquire a modest house and car. By comparison, in 2010, Canada's top-paid 100 CEOs received incomes 155 times higher than the average full-time wage. The average full-time wage was $43,000. An income 10 times larger would be $430,000, about what members of the capitalist elite make in a single week. A factor that mitigated the modest degree of Soviet income inequality was the access all Soviet citizens had to essential services at no or virtually no cost. Accordingly, the degree of material inequality was even smaller than the degree of income inequality. Soviet leaders did not live in the opulent mansions that are commonplace residences of presidents, prime ministers, and monarchs in most of the world's capitals. Gorbachev, for example, lived in a 4-family apartment building. Leningrad's top construction official lived in a 1-bedroom apartment, while the top political official in Minsk, his wife, daughter, and son-in-law, inhabited a 2-bedroom apartment. Critics of the Soviet Union accused the elite of being an exploiting ruling class. But the elite's modest incomes and humble material circumstances raised serious doubt about this assessment. If it was indeed an exploiting ruling class, it was the oddest one in human history. End of section.